everybody, once again to the community organizing webinar for APCA. So I just wanted to invite you back again. It's Alyshia here. I'm excited to see the folks who picked community organizing. Community organizing is actually my preferred method of social justice, and most of the work that I've done is community organizing. So this specific webinar has a lot of relevance to me, and I'm excited to kind of bring you on this journey and see what community organizing is going to look like for you, okay? So the first thing that I kind of want to go over with you is what is community organizing, right? So again, this is going to look very familiar, the definitions, as it should in the first PowerPoint. So it's the coordination of cooperative efforts and campaigning carried out by local residents to promote the interests of their community. Again, in social justice, community organizing is the process of building power through involving a constituency and identifying problems they share and the solutions to those problems which they desire. So, you know, you want to identify the people and structures that can make those solutions possible, and then enlist those people as targets in your effort for negotiation and using confrontation and pressure when needed. So we'll go ahead and take a look at this video and give you a little more context to community organizing.
Yeah. My name is Amara Enya, and I am a municipal consultant, which means I work with small to mid-sized cities, consulting with mayors and city managers across a broad array of policy issues. I also work in various communities, mainly in the Chicago area on different sides of the city. And I'll be giving 5 tips on effective community organizing. Tip number 1. So community organizing, we often think about communities, but I think the first tip is knowing who you are. So knowing what are the values that drive you as an individual. This means that you have to reflect on what are those key issues that impact you, what stands out to you, what issues resonate with you. Once you understand that, it makes you much more able to identify what are the issues that you as an individual would like to organize around. So the first tip is know who you are, know yourself, know what drives you, know what your passion is. Tip number 2, know the community. So to be an effective community organizer, you have to understand the community in which you will be organizing, the individuals, the residents, the community leaders. This is important. We can't take it for granted that we understand what that community needs. And so understanding the demographics of the community, understanding the different dynamics, knowing who the community leaders are, know who the gatekeepers are, know what issues are most important. Do not go in assuming that we know what that community needs. Tip number 3, know the issues. So going in with a clear understanding of what the main issues are. So in some communities, the biggest issue might be around housing. It might be around violence or public safety. It might be around unemployment or economic development. So really have an understanding of what the key issues are in that community that you'll be organizing. And it's even better when you're able to connect what their issues are with the issues that are most important to you. And this gets back to tip number 1, which is know who you are. So tip number 3 is know the issues that are most salient in that community. Tip number 4 for effective community organizing. Key community organizing requires collaboration. And in order to be able to collaborate effectively, it means you have to go in with a sense of humility, understanding that, number 1, there are already players on the ground who've been doing work in the community that you're looking to serve. So that humility is important because it puts you in the context with several other actors, several other players that are doing this work. Nothing can be done on your own. And it's also important to understand that we can't work in silos to really tackle all of the issues that are impacting the community. So collaboration is a key point, and it's essential if you're going to be effective as a community organizer. This means that we have to do the work to get to know who are the other players in that field, who are the other entities, the other nonprofits, the other community leaders that have been on the ground doing the work, and how best do you fit within that framework. What this does is it prevents you from recreating the wheel. It also prevents you from having to step on any toes from people who've already been doing the work in that space. So effective community organizing means that you have to be an effective collaborator and understand how important it is to work within a system of individuals and organizations that are doing work in that community. Tip number 5, galvanizing resources. And by resources, I mean human capital resources as well as financial resources. Effective community organizing takes money. And to be able to mobilize people, you do have to have financial resources. But more importantly is how well can you galvanize human capital resources? This means understanding the strengths that are already there, who's already on the ground, and how can you leverage them to help build your vision or to build really the community's vision for the issues that they're organizing around. So tip number 5 is definitely it's essential to bring your resources, both human capital and financial resources, to make sure that you have adequate support for your organizing effort. So the bonus tip number 6 for effective community organizing. People are drawn to positive things. People are drawn to positive visions. And so organizing is a lot of work. It's hard work, but it should also be fun, and it should be something that attracts people. One thing that good leaders do in the community is that they galvanize people to onboard to their vision. So they're able to articulate a clear vision that's something that people want to become a part of. That's how effective community organizing is done. That's how movements are started. And so having a positive organizing experience is another way to be very effective. And that means that you build people up, you build up the community that you usually would take an asset-based approach to organizing. So instead of concentrating on the negatives or concentrating on the problems in the community, really being able to identify what are the positive things that we do have to work from. What's a positive message that will really get people excited about the issues that you're organizing around? Because the goal is really to inspire the community to act for themselves and in their own best interest. And so to be an effective community organizer, you really have to have a positive message, a message that inspires, and a message that resonates with people so that they're using their own motivation to push that agenda forward. So as a bonus, a positive message, an inspiring vision, and really working effectively to galvanize people behind that vision is one of the best ways to effectively organize in any community.
Awesome, great. So let me just go ahead and get back into presenting mode really quick, and then we'll go ahead and continue on with community organizing and what it is and what it isn't, right? So basically what I wanted to cover too is she did a great job and actually kind of tied in and repeated some of the stuff that we talked about in understanding identity. And so I want to give a further in-depth look about what community organizing is and definitely what it is not. So what it is, it's building power for the long term, you know, with your group that has previously lacked power. Now, when we talk about this though, and you do use your skills, like she said, to galvanize folks to get along with your vision and your mission, what we want to talk about is that this group has previously lacked power in terms of change, but they don't lack power as a people. So we don't want to come into community organizing thinking that we are the savior, right? Or that we know best. When in reality, like she said, the goal is to motivate the community to organize for themselves. So again, using that group for the long term to build power. So you want to solve a real community problem. You know, you want to ask the community, what is the problem? What is something that they want to tackle? What's important to them? And how can you use your resources and your talent to help them solve that problem? So, you know, creating long-term capacity and leadership within a community. So again, you don't want folks who are just going to be involved with your specific event or your specific movement or your specific problem that you're tackling. You want to make sure that folks have the resources and the leadership and the education to move forward and be able to facilitate the things that you do within their own community by themselves with their own power. So defining a win as a community and taking collective action towards that win. So again, what success looks like to you is not as important as what success looks like to the community. So really what is sometimes hard to understand in community organizing and what we tend to lose focus of is that we are a conduit for the community to build their own power. we are not the answer. We are not the savior to this community, specifically when it's not a community that we belong to, right? So again, it's different when you're coming from that community, if you're going back home to where you're from and really, working within it to build it up, then, obviously your win is just as important because you're part of the community. But when you're coming into a space for a community that you don't belong to, it's really important to make sure that you take guidance and initiative from the folks that belong and live in that community and will continue to live in that community long after you have left. So what community organizing is not? Community outreach or engagement without developing leadership or power. So again, like, it's not a good idea or even effective to do community outreach and engagement and get these folks excited about, developing power and not also develop and sustain the leadership to make sure that the movement moves forward. Building friendships or social networks without relationships-based or commitment to action. So this is important to recognize because we want to be cognizant of our transactional relationships. We don't want to just reach out to people and network with people that we believe can give us something, but we also don't just want to make friends. We want to make sure that the connections that we're making are aware of our mission and our values, and that there is a mutually beneficial exchange to get this action done and to make sure that our values are heard and seen and change is made. Community organizing is also not therapy, community service, or mentoring for constituents. So what I mean by that is that obviously there is a mentoring aspect, especially if you're developing leadership, but there's not mentoring for mentoring's sake. This is not something that you're just going to check off on your college to-do list or your community service that's required for X, Y, and Z issue, or a place for therapy. And while I do admit that community organizing and being around your community and group who have similar goals as you can be cathartic, it's not a place for you to be the sole person that has to deal with or understand or attempt to tackle interpersonal issues or maybe mental health issues that you do not have the capacity to deal with. So I would definitely recommend, outsourcing or providing resources for folks who do need that help. We don't want to shun them out of the conversation or the community, but it's also part of being an effective community organizer is understanding your limits and your capacity. So community organizing tactics, again, just like direct action, community organizing can look a different way, a lot of ways, multiple ways at the same time, right? So I'm just going to go over 4 core ones that I have utilized and that I've seen other folks utilize. So online organizing. So a popular online organizing social justice movement is moveon.org or change.org. You get their petitions, you want to have them sign, they send out letters, or they have you use hashtags on Facebook and attend events and that kind of stuff. And it's really based in the internet, and it's been used as a great tool for marginalized communities to spread knowledge about key issues. So you can always have an online aspect to your organizing, but online organizing is predominantly done on the web. So the advantages of that are that it can be done anywhere in the world that somebody has access to an internet connection. But then it also helps folks who may have accessibility issues, who may not be able to show up every day in person, but still want to participate in the movement. So number 2 is education activities. So building community leaders, understanding processes, doing webinars like what I'm doing, recruiting new members, political education, and raising awareness. This helps to empower the community members and also create the long-term leadership that we just talked about, and making sure that your work is sustainable and that when you leave, this community will still have the leadership it needs to continue on its mission. And number 3 is legislative advocacy. So another way is like lobbying or lobby visits. So that's actually, going to your constituents or going to your politicians on days of action or days that they're reading bills or attempting to pass a bill, and letting your business and government leaders know where you stand in regards to that policy or to that attempted passing of a legislation. So you provide influence on what you would like to see that outcome of the legislative advocacy be. Then number 4 is vote work, registering, educating, and mobilizing voters. So voting is a key tool to getting the right representation that will advocate for your needs. So you know, there's a lot of stigma around voting. And again, that kind of goes back to, you know, transformative versus, you know, institutional social change. And a lot of people feel, you know, I'm not going to vote because my vote doesn't matter. And while I can completely understand, you know, why certain folks would feel that way, I also want to explain as well that I really believe that change is incremental. That I also believe that, you know, we are at a point right now that until we're ready to take on the U.S. government, until we're ready to take on, you know, the U.S. military and live in a commune and eat berries and really have this anarcho revolution that some people idealize, we might as well vote for folks to make our lives better. And I don't want, in community organizing, it's hard because you don't want to get caught up in this ideological purity, right? That we saw in some elections where people are like, I'm not going to vote for this candidate because they don't represent all my values. And while I understand that, and we shouldn't be forcing to vote for somebody that doesn't, not voting for those people has real world implications and dangerous policy and legislation that can be passed if we don't do the vote work, if we don't mobilize voters and get them going. So the next step is going to be determining your tactics, right? So that's always a good practice regardless of what type of method that you're using. So first, you're going to want to determine who's involved, directly affected by the decision makers, right? You'll want to consider the following. Those you want to make a behavior change and act in favor of the community, who your audience is, who you'd like to uplift your message. So who in the community are you targeting? Then determine what's the tactic, what's the ask, what's the decision and next step. So is it vote work? Is it online organizing? Is it what's going to be the most effective method for you to be able to, you know, effectively community organize? Next, you're going to want to determine when. When is the time to act? Do you need time to plan? Should you have a direct action now? Is direct action even the right method? Is it more so vote work? Is it more so a lobbying day? What is that going to look like to you? And then where? Where is a strategic place? Are you doing campaigning work? Or do you need multiple offices? Is it going to be some form of civil disobedience? You know, where should that be located at? And how to demonstrate power and make people feel uncomfortable and keep up the long-term decision. So again, lobbying, how are you advocating for the policy or legislation that you want passed? Or, you know, direct action, what are your specific asks and needs and wants at the direct action, right? So finally, your story. What's the conflict? What are your values? And what's the tactic and timeline? So we'll go over this a lot more in regards to tying your story of self to your story of us and now. But we really want to make sure that the story is a core component of your messaging. And then the other side story. So it's important to understand that you will have opposition, that community organizing is very difficult, like that video stated. And it's important to be able to frame your story and prepare to reframe it in the context of the opposition's story as well, because they're also going to have a story about why your change is not necessary and why the way that the status quo is going to be fine. So this is just a graphic of community organizing and the ways that you can move and identifying the issue and inviting the meeting. But what I really brought this graphic out for is just this quick tip that imagery is everything, right? So you've all heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? Well, the human brain processes 60,000 images 60,000 times faster than words. So when I ask you what's the image that you'd like your viewers to leave with, all of these tactics are what's going to help you determine that. When people think of your movement and when people think of community organizing and your name or your organization or your community attached to it, what do you want them to visualize? And that's going to be a really good pro tip in helping you determine your tactics. So the next thing I want to go over with all of you is MOCHA. So MOCHA is a really cute acronym for manager. Basically what MOCHA is it talks about the different roles that one can play in event planning and different types of action, right? So again, it stands for manager, owner, consultant, helper, and approver. So basically, the manager's responsibility is assigns responsibility and holds the owner accountable. And you're also there for guidance. So you're there to make suggestions, ask hard questions, review progress, serve as a resource, and intervene if necessary. The owner is the overall responsibility for the success or failure of the project. They ensure that everything gets done with all the moving parts and that everything is done appropriately. There should only ever be one owner of an event, just because you don't want conflicting ideals about what's expected. You want one person to own the event. Now, consulted people should be people that you want to ask for input or needs to be brought into the project. So, for example, if it's APCA, you can consult APCA for help with community organizing, or maybe you have another community organizing friend that you can bounce ideas off of to get this event going and running. And then helpers are assistants that, do help with the work. So if that's volunteers helping you run phone banks, or, people putting up signs around the neighborhood or doing door knocks with you, those are all types of helpers. And then approver is the person who signs off on the decisions before they're final. The manager and approver can be the same person, but the owner cannot be a manager and the owner cannot be approver. So you can, because you're the manager and you're the one who's overseeing everything, you can be the one who signs off that says, hey, this is good to go. I'm ready. I'm happy with this. Or you can have an additional outside approver approve everything so that they have a bird's eye view and haven't been involved with the process. So they might want to, you might want to get their feedback because they'll be able to see it and at a better vantage point since they're not in it, right? So I wanted to give you an idea of what MOCHA looks like in practice. So basically, here's a scenario. Let's say you're a field director and your fellow is in charge of an upcoming phone bank for voter registration, right? So because of that, you're the field director, you might be the manager on this project, which means that you're going to help to guide your owner, which is the fellow. The fellow would be the owner, so they'd be planning the upcoming phone bank, although you're there to oversee it, right? So the communications director and program director of the campaign may be the people that the fellow consults because they have done communications, they have been program directors, so obviously they've ran into phone banking and planning phone banking before. The volunteer could be the helper, so they may help set up tables, launch the sites, or be the site director. They can also be the ones that are being the helpers and making the calls to the largest donors, the most important voters. And then A is the approver of the final program on the table assignments, on the list assignments for the phone bank. So again, that could be you also, or it may be your communications director, or it may be another fellow that approves it, that has ran a few phone banks and knows that it looks the way it's supposed to. So one thing to really remember when you're the manager in MOCHA, and it has also been hard for me as a community organizer, it's sometimes as community organizers we feel like we know best and we want to do everything for everybody, but that's not successful. And like the community organizer in our video said, you can't do it alone. So if you do nothing else, at least be able to delegate as a manager. Make sure that there's a clear owner for making the project successful, and then figure out the rest of MOCHA. Finding that owner is the most important part so that you can start understanding who is responsible for the successful implementation of the project. And in fact, one of the ways to think about your challenge as a manager is to recognize that your job is to go from being an owner to a manager. So in order for you to be an effective manager, you had to have owned an event like this at one point. You had to have done a phone bank before to be able to give guidance, right? So it's also a challenge to you to be able to delegate and let go and let the owner have responsibility. And if you start to get really involved with the owner's event and them, their capacity to run it, just ask yourself, should I really be the owner on this, or should I be handing this over to somebody else? Should I really be stepping in like this, or should I let my owner handle it? Do I have faith in my owner, or does something need to be intervened, right? And if you come back and you realize that, you have to take a step back so that your owner can succeed, make sure that you do that. That's your challenge as a manager. So what I want to talk to you about in terms of community organizing is story of self. Story of self is probably the most, if not one of the most important aspects of community organizing, because it allows you to tell your story and the importance, right? So there's three main elements to a story of self. It's the challenge, the choice, and the outcome. So basically, all plots begin with an unexpected challenge in the front that confronts the character and gives you an urgent need to pay attention. The choice then yields an outcome, right? So you want to talk about a choice that they're unprepared for and how that outcome teaches a moral lesson. And because we can empathetically identify with the character, we can feel the moral. We not only hear about someone's courage, but we can also be inspired by it, right? So the story of the character in his or her efforts to engage around values engages the listener's own challenge, choice, and outcome. So really what your story of self is slated to do is to make sure that you are inspiring somebody else to recognize their own story of self and how your stories are tied, right? So each story should include the challenge, the choice, and the outcome. It's not enough to say, I was scared. You need to say, I was scared, I needed to decide, and when I did, it learned it was possible. So you're giving the problem, you decided that you needed to decide, and when you did, there was this outcome, and you learned that it was possible, and that was a moral engagement for you. So developing your story of self. So this is actually going to be an exercise as well. So I want you to participate in these things. So go ahead and feel free to pause the webinar at any point so that you can develop your story of self and share it with your peers, okay? So you also want to think about these questions because the story of self is not a fictional story. When you're talking about story of self, you're talking specifically about the story of you and why you're involved in the work. So what is the issue you're passionate about? Is it racism, sexism, hate crimes, violence? What will you be calling on others to do? So what is the ask? Are you asking them to help, volunteer to register folks to vote so you can get ex-representative out of office because they're being racist? Is that your goal? What values move you to take action? So again, going back to that first webinar, and what are your values and what does your vision and value statement look like? And how do you use that to inspire action in others who may have a similar mission or value statement? And what stories from your own life can you tell about specific people or events that would help you convey to others how you learned or acted on your values, right? So again, I listed these as we're going to go into the exercise just to give you some ideas. So when we think about family and childhood, do you have specific experiences with your parents, with your community, with role models, with school? Did you have to make tough life choices with partners, schools, or jobs, or hobbies, interests, experiences, finding your passion, experiences overcoming challenges? Is there influential people or books that helped you make a tough decision? Is it the volunteering, activism, or service of your life that's helped you make these decisions? Is it awareness of others? Is it traveling? What has sparked you to have your story of self? So let's start brainstorming, right? So your exercise is using the categories from the previous slide. Fill out the below boxes. So what was your challenge? What was your specific challenge you faced? So again, this can be something in family, in school and jobs, in other, but I want you to list a challenge that you have faced in your life in this first box. And then what was your specific choice that you made? What did you do? Was it courageous? Was it not? Was it beneficial? Was it not? And talk about that choice. You know, sometimes story of selves are not always success stories. Sometimes it's one of the deepest and darkest things that we've decided that has really worked against us that helps propel us forward into a more positive light. So again, it's important to talk about the outcome. What happened as a result of your choice? And even if it's a bad choice, is it something that can help others? Do you have something that is really inspiring? Or, you know, what is it that's going to tie your story of self to your story of others? So what I want to do is watch this video. Whatever you feel about President Obama, he is a fantastic orator, right? He is amazing at his speeches. He is so eloquent. He is so compelling, and it makes people pay attention and stand up and listen. So that's kind of what you're trying to do with your story of self to the story of us and the story of now. You want to make sure that when you're presenting these things in public, and public can mean one more person, public can mean an entire group, really whatever it means to you, you want to make sure it includes 3 elements. So again, your story of self, talking about what is your background, what are the choices you made, and how it's related to the challenge in the community, and how you can aspire a we, right? And then you want to talk about story of of us. Your challenge will be to define us upon whom you'll call to join you in action. So going back to your story of self, what is your ask? What are the shared values you're asking of these people so that they feel that there is an us in your story? And then the story of now. So story of now is urgent. It requires dropping other things and paying attention. It's rooted in values you celebrated in your story and of self and us. So basically, you're taking this very personal story of your choice, challenge, and outcome. You're explaining how your values and the work that you're involved with has influenced and the story of self, and that's now creating a story of us and the people who are involved and do the same work as you. And then you take the story of self and us and turn it into the story of now. So what are we doing now to urgently address these issues? How can we use our stories to create change? And so I want to go ahead and watch this video just to give you a better idea and background of what that can look like.
Barack Obama in 2004 was totally unknown. People were saying, I don't know who this guy is. I wonder why they picked him.
He had his reputation as a bit of an upstart, as sort of a young, rising figure in the party, but no one knew who this guy was. This was his chance to introduce himself to people.
Tonight is a particular honor for me because, let's face it, my presence on this stage is pretty unlikely. My father was a foreign student, born and raised in a small village in Kenya.
What makes a great political speech is if you can somehow fold your story into this larger American story.
The next thing he says is about his mother's family. His grandfather fought in World War II. He used the GI Bill. They settled in Kansas, so white people could say, he's just like us.
My parents shared not only an improbable love, they shared an abiding faith in the possibilities of this nation. I stand here knowing that my story is part of the larger American story, that I owe a debt to all of those who came before me, and that in no other country on earth is my story even possible.
Going into this speech, we've had 4 years of George Bush, and we felt as a country like we'd grown further apart.
04 was very much a divisive partisan race. Obama's speech is in some ways an antidote to that.
Alongside our famous individualism, there's another ingredient in the American saga. A belief that we're all connected as one people. If there is a child on the south side of Chicago who can't read, that matters to me even if it's not my child. If there's a senior citizen somewhere who can't pay for their prescription drugs and having to choose between medicine and the rent, that makes my life poorer even if it's not my grandparent. It is that fundamental belief, I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper, that makes this country work. E pluribus unum, out of many, one.
He gives a speech that presages his entire political message in 2008, which is this sort of post-partisan argument.
Now, even as we speak, there are those who are preparing to divide us. The spin masters, the negative ad peddlers, who embrace the politics of anything goes. Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
Obama was born with two great gifts. One is his mind, and the other is his ability to speak to large groups of people.
There are three things that Obama does that really makes that speech effective. He wants concrete detail. He likes story, and he loves antithesis, the use of repetition in structure to show contrast. There is not a liberal America or a conservative America. There is one America.
There is not a black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America. The pundits like to slice and dice our country into red states and blue states, but I've got news for them too. We worship an awesome God in the blue states, and we don't like federal agents poking around in our libraries in the red states. We coach Little League in the blue states. And yes, we've got some gay friends in the red states. We are one people, all of us pledging allegiance to the Stars and Stripes, all of us defending the United States of America.
The way he uses his hands, he actually points a lot, does a lot of this, a lot of this, a lot of that.
In doing so, he gives off this sense of energy. I am new. I'm someone who is dynamic.
And he doesn't do that so much anymore. He's a little more solemn and reserved when he gives speeches today. And I think it's more reflective of his office.
In the end, that's what this election is about. Do we participate in a politics of cynicism, or do we participate in a politics of hope? It's the hope of slaves sitting around a fire singing freedom songs. The hope of immigrants setting out for distant shores. The hope of a young naval lieutenant bravely patrolling the Mekong Delta. The hope of a mill worker's son who dares to defy the odds. The hope of a skinny kid with a funny name who believes that America has a place for him too. Hope in the face of difficulty. Hope in the face of uncertainty. The audacity of hope.
His appearance at that convention, which was the best speech of the convention, better than John Kerry's, was electrifying. And without it, he wouldn't be president.
I think sincerity means a lot. There are people who, when they speak the truth as they see it, and they're very effective doing that.
I believe this country will reclaim its promise, and out of this long political darkness, a brighter day will come. Thank you very much, everybody. God bless you.
All right. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and get this back. So again, just before we get into canvassing best practices, Obama was so effective. I mean, we see Hillary Clinton clapping for him, and it kind of touched on a lot of how he was able to tie the story of self to the story of us and now, right? And talk with conviction and talk from his heart about what he sees as the future of America. And so just those things to keep in mind when you are deciding to take your story of self to the public, if you are at a point in community organizing where you are doing the ask and asking people to get involved in what you want and what you need, right? So the next thing that I kind of want to go over with you is a big part of community organizing is canvassing, okay? Canvassing is basically when you go out into the community, and whether that's for VR, mail drops, petitions, or door knockings to let people know about your organization or your campaign that you're working with, you're gonna be boots on the ground, right? So while this canvassing best practices is specific to voter registration, it is something that you can use for mail drops, petitions, or door knocking. So you want to divide things up into the night before, where we're talking about 5 p.m. the night before. You want to send out reminder texts to all your volunteers, get a confirmation from the attending people who are coming to your canvas, ensure to clarify any parking or location questions at the time, and if applicable, send a map of a station, right? So that's really important to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same playing field and understands exactly where they need to be the next day, So then after that, you want to assemble packets based on confirmation numbers plus 3 extra. So if packets are applicable. So if you are doing mail drops or voter registrations or door knockings or literature drops, you're going to want to make sure that you have black pens, that you have the VR forms, that you have packets to assemble for them to be able to drop at their locations on their walk, right? And then you're going to also want to assemble your clipboard. So like I said, it's important to make sure that your packets are assembled onto clipboards so that they're easy to take for your people who are volunteering and helping you canvass. Let's see here. And so on the day of, you're going to want to arrive 45 minutes before canvassing time to set up clipboards, snacks, and any other applicable items. So tables, tablecloths, anything. You want to make sure that there are some people who are going to be early birds and want to come like hours before your scheduled canvassing. So it's important to make sure that you arrive there way ahead of schedule in case you do run into those folks. And also so you're set up by the time everybody gets there. If you're set up and organized, it's going to make the day go smoother, and it's going to make your volunteers feel like you know what you're doing. You also want to allow for 30 minutes for arrival and 30 minutes for debrief. So for example, if you having a 2-hour shift from 5 to 7, you also need to understand that most likely they won't get out there until 5:30, and they'll probably come around 6:30 because they're going to want to make sure that they get back in time from wherever their location is. They might have trouble finding parking or getting there on time to the site. So just always make sure that you plan time for that. So if you really want 2 hours full of canvassing, then you want, instead of having them come at 5, you'd want them to come at 4:30. And then also all documents must be filled out. So like I said, this is specific to voter registration. So one thing that's accurate across the nation is that all forms need to be filled out in black ink. The name, address, social or alien registration or tribal ID number needs to be filled out, and so does the phone number. And you need to make sure when you're filling out voter registration forms to double check that the voter is a citizen over 18 and sign the form. At the end of your shift, you're going to want to make sure canvasser care is number 1. So if you have it in your budget, you want to make sure you buy waters, like snacks, so your canvassers can have access, and pack it into a cooler to bring to the canvassing shift. There's nothing like a cold bottle of water after coming back from a long day of canvassing, I'll tell you that. And then you're also going to want to make sure you have time for a debrief. So how was the experience? What went well? What didn't? Are there suggestions for next time? Is there any inaccessible areas with like unruly pets like dogs, or you know, where there's locks on the gates and you can't get in? Or did you have a bad interaction with anyone, and anything we need to follow up about so that people feel safe and don't feel that, you know, that they're in danger, don't want to come back to your canvas, right? So you want to also thank them for their time. Highlight how this canvas wouldn't have been possible without them, and let them know you'll be contacting them again in the future. So people really underestimate what a thank you does, but you really want to make sure that you thank these people. They're taking time out of their days to volunteer, to you know, make sure that your vision is being realized. And so really make sure that you value these people. And it's like, you have to put people first. And one thing that I will say about canvassing or community organizing or anything like that is, if you are people-centered and people first, your success will come. If you focus on the success and forget about the people, you are not going to get the outcome that you want to. So also I wanted to talk about some common voter registration challenges, because, you know, voter reg can be quite difficult. You know, you get a lot of different types of people that come in and, you know, have different feelings about voting, and you can run into a lot of different things. So one thing I like to say is I like to introduce myself in my org before I ask someone to register to vote. I'm sure you've all been in spaces where it's like, are you registered to vote? Are you registered to vote? Are you registered to vote? And people are just like, no, 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 I'm good. Because it's hard to, it's so easy to, you know, ignore someone like that that's just asking a question. So what I do is I go up to the person. I'm like, hi, my name's Alyshia. I'm with so-and-so organization. We're doing some voter registration work out here today. How are you doing? And they're like, good. How are you? Blah, blah, blah. And be like, hey, yeah, you know, I was just reaching out here because I want to make sure that everyone's voices are being heard and we're registering people to vote. So are you registered to vote? And now that you've created that 15 seconds of conversation with them and that connection, it's going to be very hard to, 1, lie to you about being registered to vote, but 2, to walk away without not giving you some decency and courtesy, right? So the second thing is, if you do ask someone and they say, we're already signed up, a good question to ask is, are you signed up for the PEVL? In Arizona, that stands for the Permanent Early Voting List. And some people are always like, no, what's that? What's the PEVL? And you're like, oh, great. Well, let me tell you about it. So the PEVL is the Permanent Early Voting List. Basically, you sign up to get your ballot in the mail, so you can vote from your couch and stand in pajamas, and you don't have to stand in long lines for election day. So make it sound appealing. You know, it's, I vote from home. You know, I don't have to go to the polls on any election day, and I know my voice is being heard, and I can just send it in at my convenience. So the PEVL is another really good way if someone's already registered to get them to re-register with you. So if someone says, I don't believe in voting, my vote doesn't count when you ask them, I always try to have a genuine conversation, because even if they don't register to vote, the fact that you were the person who took the time out to ask them, why are you disenchanted with voting? What can we do better to get you re-engaged? Will mean something to them, because it shows that you're actually caring, not just about the numbers of voters, but about the actual community who's voting. So I asked them, when did you become disenchanted with voting? What was the issue that you really care about? And highlight how voting changes those issues. So, you may not care, you may not think that the president matters, but do you care in your local elections about who's regulating your clean water? If you're not registered to vote, you can't even vote in the local elections for X, Y, and Z reasons, right? So making sure that they don't see it just as a macro thing, but as a micro thing as well. And you always want to run a role play of VR with best practices. So voter registration also stands for VR. So do not send your canvassers out, do not send anybody out who has not run a role play with voter registration, because they're going to be stuck, they're not going to know what to do. So you want to make sure that you have these different scenarios where someone responds like, I don't believe in voting, or, oh, I'm already registered, and have them practice introducing themselves, have them practice having that conversation so that they can be effective in their registrations. And then also you want to assign turf with minivan or paperless. So this is something that's specific to campaigning, specific to voter registration. It might be a little confusing initially, when we're talking about it, because you're not necessarily doing this exact work. But turf is basically where you send someone to do voter registration. Minivan is an app that anybody can download on their smartphone, where it'll have a list of addresses that you need to door knock on. And then you can also do paperless if Minivan is not available to folks. And then you also want to clarify any lingering questions. You don't want anyone to walk out feeling like their questions weren't answered, because then they're going to have questions on the field, and then it's going to make them less effective and less engaged with voter registration. So another thing that I kind of want to go over with community organizing is that there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, which means that there's always potential for conflict, right? And so we really want to talk about working through interpersonal conflict, working through organizational conflict, and to make sure that your organization keeps running smoothly and that the work's getting done. So the first scenario we're going to deal with is coalition, right? So that there's actually issues with your organization and in your organization. So the scenario is this. Your group is part of a multiracial coalition fighting for economic justice. The coalition consists of white, Black, Hispanic, Latino, Eastern Asian, Southern Asian, and Native folks. Though it seems like a good idea to join at first, lately the space has been toxic for members of color, specifically those identifying as queer and gender nonconforming. The white people in the group have asserted themselves several times as experts, and people of color's voices have repeatedly been undermined. Furthermore, within the people of color groupings, it seems that each group feels as if their oppression is greater than the next person's, and queer and gender nonconforming individuals are being silenced. You belong to one of the people of color groups. Members of your group have repeatedly experienced harm in this space, and they're beginning to think that this coalition might not be the best place to get their needs met. Less members are attending meetings, but you will still find value in knowing what other community members are doing to fight for economic justice. What do you do? So every scenario is different. I'm going to give you some general best practices for things that kind of happen like this. So one is hold a retreat workout to work out tension. Whether that's a day retreat, a few hours, you want to do some group exercises and get these people relating to each other and their values again. Remind your folks of common values and goals, and maybe, going over some of the exercises that we did on value statements, or what the one value is, and what can you do to build community and team while still making sure that these folks feel safe. So you always also want to remind them of identity in the context of power. So, obviously people are really tied to their personal experience, and it's important that we recognize that. But we also understand that there are people who are disproportionately targeted more than others, right? So we want to make sure that, like for example, me having straight hair, sometimes I feel like, oh, my straight hair is limp, limp and it has no volume and it's just ugly and stringy, and I hate having my straight hair, right? And so that's important to me. That's an important part of my identity, and that's where I think like it's better to have curly hair, and you're lucky if you have curly hair, blah, 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 right? So in the context of power, although that's my experience and it's valid, in the context of power, if you have quote unquote ethnic or curly hair, or hair that is considered to be closer to like African descent or roots, it is very difficult to find products for your hair. It is very difficult to find them at all the stores near you. And also, those products are usually the most hyper surveilled in the store because people think you're more prone to stealing from those areas. So I am never told that my hair is ugly or nappy or too curly or frizzy or whatever. And I am never hard pressed as someone with straight hair to find products that can work for my hair at any store. So in the context of power, I have a privilege. I have a privilege having hair that's widely accepted and catered to in society. So again, like kind of finding the nuances and context of power. And then develop community agreements, contracts, and have every member sign. So have your group identify 10 no-nonsense rules that everyone must abide to, and have everybody sign that. And if people are refusing to, listen to that community agreement and uphold the contract, then they'll be asked to leave. And so that way you can maintain the safety and sharing of the space. Also, give the queer and gender non-conforming folks a safe space to express their frustration and solutions. So whether that's you meeting, the facilitator or group leader, meeting after hours with them and then kind of creating a list to share with other folks, or giving a space where only they are allowed to speak about their experiences. You want to make sure that these, especially, queer and gender non-conforming folks of color, are disproportionately targeted in society. So you want to make sure you're uplifting their voices and making sure they're heard. So the second scenario has to do with team dynamics. So this is the scenario. Lately, convening with members of your organizing group has been difficult. Certain individuals in the group who are perceived very knowledgeable have been taking up a lot of space during meetings. New members have been feeling intimidated about voicing their opinions, and it's becoming harder and harder to get folks to show up to meetings and events. The same few people are showing up and are either dominating the space or not adding much to it. There's plenty of work to be done in terms of moving the issues your community cares about, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to get members to show up and help out. What do you do? So one thing that I'd like to introduce here is introducing Take Space, Make Space. So Take Space, Make Space is a community organizing agreement where your whole coalition can agree upon it. And it's a method where folks who take up a lot of space are challenged to make space for others who may not speak up usually. So if you notice you're speaking a lot, or you notice, one person hasn't spoken the whole event, calling them in to allow them to express themselves and making sure we're creating a space for them. You also want to introduce one star, one mic. So this is the idea that the star, or the one person who is speaking, is the only person who is speaking, and they're the only person who's speaking because there's only one mic and they have it, right? So you can actually use it as like a physical thing, if it's like a ball or a teddy bear or something, or an actual plastic microphone, and when someone's speaking and they're holding that object, no one else in the room can speak or interrupt them. So that way they can get their full thought out and still feel like they're being heard while making sure there's space for everyone. So the next scenario is territories, right? So let's say you're organizing on a college campus and your group is really starting to gain momentum and you might even be close to a win. You've been notified that a well-known national organization who organizes around the same issues as your group intends on forming a chapter on your campus. Though you've put a lot of time and resources into relationship building, you're fearful that this organization may halt some of the progress you've made by taking some of your members. Though this organization ultimately is fighting for the same cause as you, they haven't had any presence on your campus and may end up getting credit for a lot of the work you've put in if you get the win you're looking for. So what do you do? So this kind of ties back to, making sure that you're not doing fly in, fly out community organizing, or you're reaching out to the community to make sure that you're giving them what they want and what they actually need. So it's always good to introduce yourself in your org. You know, you want to meet with the leaders, you want to talk about leadership and styles and practices and how you're both doing the same work. You want to discuss power mapping and partnership. Can you two work together? Is there a way that you guys can use each other's affinity groups to make the work more effective and share the win? And if partnership isn't possible, agreeing on turf boundaries and scheduling for each org to be in the space. So it's like you have the campus Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and we have it Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, you know, and just really working out a method that's best for you to make sure that you're also getting access to the campus and the work that you've been doing. And then the most important thing is to make sure that the communication is open. Understand and make sure that the org understands that you two need to be in constant communication as you're doing this work to share this win. So the last thing that I want to talk about for this specific webinar is self and community care. So I think a reoccurring theme that you've heard and things that you can just kind of recognize from participating in the webinar is that community organizing is difficult and it's hard and it's grueling, but it should be fun and you should take time to care for yourself. So there's 4 steps to self and community accountability. So something that I've been touching on throughout this PowerPoint is define your values as a group. What are some value statements? What are some non-negotiables? What are some things that you guys need to decide or achieve in order to guarantee that your long-term goals are met? And what can you compromise on if it isn't met? What are things that you can't compromise on? And kind of understanding that and having everyone agree to it. The second one is creating a standard for lack of accountability. So this is going to look it's going to be difficult for every org and look different for every org. So we often want to accommodate everyone and the needs of everyone on the team. And while it is important to carve out that space to ensure everyone is practicing self-care and sustaining their mind and bodies, you cannot do that at the risk of the program/project goals and mission. So, you know, if the goals are not being met, what is the protocol in place to address individuals who fail to hold themselves accountable? So it's like if you have the standard that everybody has to be there by 9 a.m. and you have one person who just consistently cannot show up at 9 a.m. but their excuse is that, you know, they are going to school and working full time and doing 21-hour credits, and so they just keep waking up late. It's like, you know, you want to be accommodating and accessible to them, and maybe you can find a different capacity for them to be involved in, but they also need to hold themselves to the standard of the organization for you know, successful goal implementation. And if they can't do that, it is your responsibility of the org to make sure that we're calling that out and making sure that they're accountable. So right after that, we're going to go ahead and provide consistent feedback. So what I mean by providing consistent feedback is that you want to make sure that you're having open communication with your people, right? So sometimes not everyone can meet the expectations that we're asking are required. In those situations, you want to be sure to provide peer-to-peer feedback. Have folks complete anonymous evaluations. Make sure that people have spaces to talk about team members or in a positive way, or, you know, give constructive feedback. They want to make sure that people are feeling like every team member is contributing to the success of the organization and holding up their end of the bargain. So always, as an org, you have to be open to consistent feedback. And 4, you want to make sure that in whatever organizing space you're in, that leaving room and space for folks to step out and have self-reflection is always welcome and encouraged. So sometimes a lot of this stuff can be a lot at once, and there's a lot of things that we want to move through and you know, understand and digest, and sometimes people need to leave the room for self-reflection for that. So what I would say is, you know, make sure that that's encouraged. Make sure that you create a space for self-reflection. Some people have like self-care rooms or places where it can be quiet, or people can meditate or pray or do what they need to do to feel like they're back in a healthy headspace and can continue to participate with the community. So this is one of the last things that I do want to show you. So this is actually my favorite quote about community organizing, and it is that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And so I really believe that. I really believe that a small group of committed citizens is what changes things, and it's what gets people going and can really make such a huge incredible change for our country. So I just want to share this quick BuzzFeed video with you about people who consider themselves activists and kind of some of the misconceptions around that.
I'm an activist, but it's hard to process so much death and pain sometimes.
Like the thought that I could have a son and he could just be taken from me at any minute, and people expect me to just kind of sit there and be passive about it. Like, who wouldn't be angry about that?
I'm an activist, but I'm not angry. I just get angry when people are ignorant. You know, the world won't change just because we wish it to. Like, we'll have to work to make it happen. And that work is like hard and slow and painful sometimes, but it requires like real work to change things.
I'm an activist, but I don't speak for all Black women. It's just like the many different crossroads that Black women sit at. So I'm a Black woman, but I relate to Black girls. I live in a world of semi-privilege.
I'm an activist, and sometimes I'm angry because there should be justice. Why are we always have this discussion because we should have justice.
I'm an activist, but a lot of the things that I stand up for, I never experienced firsthand.
Activism is a commitment to figure out how to change the world to be a better place, and that comes in many forms. There's no one type of activist or one type of activism.
The idea of equality isn't something that's just an idea. It's something that we can actively change, we can make happen.
I want for my kids and my nephews and nieces to be able to be comfortable in this world.
I have the luxury of choosing to be an activist, and I think more people should choose to be an activist on any level.
I'm an activist, but I use comedy as my vehicle of change. Comedy is about truth, so it helps me to be honest. This way people can see the truth and laugh about it, but maybe they think about it later and say, maybe that's something that needs to change.
I'm an activist, and without justice, there will be no peace.
I'm an activist, and I think that social media does affect real change.
I'm an activist, but I'm not always conscious of it.
I'm an activist, and I am super shy.
I'm an activist, and I know if the movement is bigger than me, it's bigger than you, it'll take all of us to win.
Awesome. Okay, so I really like that video because it kind of shows like different perspectives from different folks who are involved in the work. But it also, talks about some of the misconceptions on what people think that activism can and can't be. A lot of these people are prominent folks with a huge social media following who have been involved in the organizing world for quite some time. So, and all of them started out just like you, watching a first webinar, watching a first presentation on what community organizing is and how it got them involved. So never doubt that you are part of the small group, or you will start the small group of thoughtful, committed citizens who will change the world. Thanks so much, and we look forward to seeing you out in the community and enacting some real positive change. Take care.